Rahim. Right now, I'm going to do a brief discussion on chapter one. And please watch this video all the way through because afterwards, when we get to the end, I'm going to talk about some discussion questions that we're going to talk about when we meet. You're supposed to read chapter one, you're supposed to read chapter two, and I think I'm gonna be posting a lecture on chapter two real soon for our PowerPoint so you can get a kind of grasp on what we kind of going to look at, what's going to be important, that we're going to go over all that in class when we meet on April 5th and April 12th. So that's kind of what I want you all to look at. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some of the questions I want you to reflect on. So when we meet, them going to be some of the things that we're going to talk about in our discussion and also any questions you might have from the chapter, okay? So sit back and kind of enjoy as we kind of go through this, okay? In chapter one of the most important things you could do is look at the history of something. And when you're looking at the history of something, how did it start, how did it begin? But you also got to understand, you got to define what are you talking about? What are we talking about when we talk about testing? What are we talking about when we talk about assessments? All right. So, chapter one, of course, we're going to go over the history of testing and assessment. And I'm Dr. Malik Rahim, and I'm going to just kind of go over this for you. And we're going to, the highlights of chapter one. And at the end, we're going to, like I said, go over some journalized questions that we're going to discuss when we actually meet up face to face in our virtual classroom on Zoom. Distinguishing between testing and assessment, like I said earlier, you have to be able to determine what are you talking about so everyone be on the same page. So what is testing? What is assessment? How are they related? Are they related? Okay. And those are some of the key components that you have to do whenever you're talking about a construct that can have different meanings. And you want to make sure everyone's talking about the same thing. So you have to define it, right? So when it comes to testing, tests are a subset of assessment, yielding scores based on collective data. Um, an example of this is finding the sum of correct items on a multiple choice exam. Assessment procedures can be some of the following: formal, with rigor in test development, good, valid, and reliable. Informal, rigor has not been demonstrated in the test development. Okay. There are several types of assessments that we have to look at. There's the informal assessment. The informal assessment are observation, rating scales, classification methods, records of personnel documents, and so forth, right? The ability testing is achievement and aptitude testing, survey battery readiness, diagnostic, intellectual and cognitive functioning, cognitive ability testing. Those are some of the abilities testing. Then you have what's known as the clinical interview, and we'll go over that as well. But the clinical interview is when you're kind of doing an assessment, kind of working with the person, and we'll show you some examples of a clinical interview during the course of the class. Um, personality testing. Personality testing is objective tests, projective tests, and interest inventories. And these are assessment procedures. So it's like, so this is what we got to do to make an assessment. So these are all the things that we do to determine on making an assessment. The emergence of ability tests tested in cognitive domain. So what's some of the history that's behind assessments? There are three areas that we need to look at: individual intelligence testing, neuropsychological assessment, group testing of ability. Individual intelligence tests. And Binet in 1890 created what was known as an IQ test, right? And it was functional, but he was hired by the French Ministry of Public Education to integrate children into the schools. Um, because of the time frame, and I'm hoping that no one get offended by this, but I can understand if you do. But in the book, it used the term subnormal because of the time frame and trying to keep in context with the language that was being used at the time. But it's like that is very inappropriate to today's standards. They developed, but they developed the first modern day intelligence test, right? And later on, it was revised by Tremaine at Stanford, and he revised the Binet scale. That's why you get the Stanford Binet, right? And some of you teachers and some of you all who are going to school counseling will become very, very familiar with because this is one of the main IQ tests that are out there. There are other IQ tests, but this is one of the main ones that are being used in a lot of school systems. Um, they define IQ as um, mental age over chronological age. Mental age divided by chronological age. And neuropsychological assessments, looking at different things like head injuries and brain damage and neurological damage. So head injuries was being examined and studied over 5,000 years ago in Egyptian medics, right? And there's a lot of Egyptian medical documents that are holding, evidence that even back then, and during the 5,000 years ago in Egyptian time, they would study um, neurological issues and brain injuries and head injuries. In World War I, it was increased interest in brain injuries. That's one of the reasons they start using helmets. They have the soldiers use helmets. So there's an increased interest in brain injuries. The 20th century brought along the development of brain imaging techniques, right? And today, suspected changes in brain function use neuropsychological assessments. When it gets to group testing, what we're basically looking at is like the Army Alpha and the Army Beta test, right? And those are used kind of for placement of different individuals. As we move on, you'll see that they were developed by Yerkes, Termaine, and others, and the Army Alpha used by the Eugenics Movement. And what the Eugenics Movement is, if you don't know, was what they were looking at was like they took Darwin's philosophy of survival evolution, and they looked at that they wanted to just kind of like eliminate what they considered a weaker human, weaker people, weaker cultures. They wanted to eliminate, so they were like, doing these experiments. They were doing things for sterilization. They were doing things to try to eliminate certain cultures, and they were encouraging men and women not to reproduce with certain types of people. After World War II, you had more vocational testing being done. The SATs developed by James Bryant and to equalize educational opportunities for all. But as you all know, a lot of it was culturally biased. But the principle was good when it comes to making sure white males got equal opportunity. Let's be honest, that's what it basically was for. Um, Vocational counseling led to special aptitude tests and multiple aptitude tests, and that's when you get into things like the ASVAB, and well, we get into it. But Edward Thorndike was one of the key figures in the Stanford Achievement Test. Frank Parson was the father of vocational studies, and he looked into things like career counseling, um, vocational counseling, and multiple aptitude tests, group tests of ability, focus on job attainment, and that's when the ASVAB. The ASVAB is the Armed Forces test to kind of find out what your career is going to be. So like that's where it kind of you know kind of built off of with uh, the work of Dr. Frank Parsons. Um, Emergence of different personality tests, testing effective realms, the interest inventories and vocational assessments, and what that is they were trying to match your interests with potential careers. So, like if you have certain interests, what they'll say is, since you have these interests, you probably will enjoy this career, right? And hopefully, we'll be able to look at some of those exam tests and kind of understand what they're doing. Probably because we're virtual, we might not be able to take them and score them, but I'll see what we can do. The objective personality assessment, projective testing, interest inventories, and vocational assessments continue. Thorndike and Minor, early assessors of interest. Strong, one of the most popular one, the strong vocational interest blank, and it was a strong interest inventory is one of the most popular ones. Objective personality assessments, World Association test to study schizophrenia. And what they would do was they would do like the word association to see how you thought and the process you thought in. Um, but some of these tests don't have a good level of reliability, and some of the validity in some of these older tests are even questioned. Through the Woodworth personal data sheet was a crude test to assess for neurosis and pathology, and it was a forerunner to the MMPI. When it gets to projective testing, Galton and projective testing was very popular. And one of the things that he said was experiments such as these allow an unexpected amount of illumination to enter into the deepest recesses of the character, which are open and bare by them like the anatomy of an animal under the scalpel of a dissector in broad daylight. What the projective test was, it was trying to get into your inner thoughts and some of the things that you had maybe re- repressed, and that's what projective testing was trying to do. So, kind of trying to bring out some of the unconscious things that were going on with you. Um, so, like, it looked at different things, and so, like I said, trying to bring out the different things as far as like making sure that some of the things that you might not be openly aware of or conscious, that's what projective tests were trying to bring out and kind of help see some of the things that you weren't really ready to face. Carl Jung was very big in projective testing. He had 156 stimulus words to which individuals would respond, right? And of course, it was like word association. And it was used to detect different people complexes, different things that were going on with you, different issues, right? The Rorschaer Tests, and a lot of you all might have already heard of the ink blot test from Rorschaer. And then there's the Henry Murray's TAC test, right? The thematic appreciation test. So we'll be looking at some of these during the course of the term, hopefully, on the second half of our classes when we meet. When it comes to informal assessment procedures, we get situational tests contrive naturalistic situations, and that will include like the clinical interview, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, fifth edition. Sixth edition should be coming out soon. Um, I'm not 100% sure it's going to be a sixth edition or whether it's going to be a revision to the fifth, but some of the changes I've heard that they're thinking about making and they're possibly going to be making probably sound like it's more going to be a sixth edition, but we'll know more about that probably later on this year. Um, Observation, the rating scales, classification techniques, records and personnel data, environmental assessments, performance-based assessment, ICD-10. These are some of the things that are used during informal assessment procedures. What are some of the modern day uses of assessment procedures? Um, during computer use, statistical procedures has increased the quality of the test um, because you can get your results back a lot faster with using computers. Um, the tests are scored quicker with computers. Um, we can view tests in the following categories. Tests in the cognitive domain, often called ability testing. Tests in the affective domain are usually called personality assessment and informal assessment procedures. So those are some of the things that we look at. And when you look at this graph, these next couple of graphs, you look at to see how everything is categorized. So it's like when you look at the assessment of ability, it's basically what one can do, right? And it broken down into the achievement test and the aptitude test. And in the achievement test, you look at uh, one has learned, what the person has learned. And aptitude is what they're capable of learning. And so, like the achievement tests are usually looked at with survey batteries, diagnostic, and readiness. With the aptitude test, what you're looking at are cognitive ability tests, intellectual and cognitive functioning tests, special aptitude tests, and multiple aptitudes. And then you break that down with the intellectual and cognitive function with intelligence testing and neuropsychological assessments. Okay, so that's how when you break down the assessments of ability, it's broken down into two parts as far as subjects, and then those subjects create sub-subjects, and so that's how it gets broken down even further. When you're looking at the personality assessment, it's similar to the um, the other one, but with the personality assessment, you're looking at the person's temperament, their habits, their likes, their disposition, their nature. And then there are three ways that you look at that: the objective, projective, and interest. And even with those, it's broken down on which one of these components you're going to be looking at. So with the objective is paper and pencil. The projective is unstructured as far as responses, kind of like a word association. And interests are the likes and the dislikes. Okay. Then you have the informal assessment instruments, and them are usually observations, rating scales, classification methods, environmental assessment, record and personal uh, documents, and performance-based assessments. Okay. Um, these are some of the questions that I want us to go over, and I want you to kind of think about one before we meet up on the 5th or the 12th. Okay, so these are some of the things I want us to look at. Right? How valid is the information gained from assessment instruments? How should that information be applied? How do assessment instruments invade an individual's privacy? And does the government have the right to insist an individual be assessed? Can the use of assessment instruments in some cases lead to labeling? And what are the implications for the individual who are labeled? Are assessment procedures used to foster equality for all people, or do they tend to create a society based on class? Okay, so that'll conclude chapter one, and I'm gonna be posting this to Canvas, and then later on we're gonna be posting chapter two. But make sure you read chapter one and chapter two prior to coming to class, and after that we'll go over the questions, and then we'll just kind of break everything down. Okay, so thank you, and I will see you soon.